May I touch?
Then let's get married.
I asked the most feared man in Campania if I could touch his arm. In my defense, the arm in question was extraordinary. He had been wrestling a spooked horse back into its stall, not commanding his men to do it, but doing it himself, sleeves rolled to his elbows, feet planted in the dirt, absorbing the full weight of the animal's panic, through nothing but his grip on the lead rope, and a voice so low and steady it seemed to reach directly into the horse's nervous system and switch something off. It took 4 minutes. I know, because I counted. I had been counting things I shouldn't count since the moment I arrived at Don Ciro Santangelo's countryside estate for a weekend that my family had assured me would be perfectly unremarkable. The horse calmed. Allo released the rope. His white linen shirt clung to his back, damp with effort, and his chest rose and fell with the particular exhaustion of a man who had just subdued half a ton of frightened muscle through sheer physical discipline. Then he turned and caught me staring. "Something has caught your attention, Signorina Ferretti." His voice carried across the stable yard, low, faintly amused, entirely too aware of exactly how long I had been standing there, which was, for the record, long enough to be either embarrassing or criminal, depending on which aunt you asked. I should have apologized. I should have said something about admiring the horse, or the weather, or the fascinating architectural qualities of the stone fence post. Instead, and I blame the afternoon light, and the forearms, and the specific, devastating way his dark hair fell across his forehead, I walked closer. "I was admiring your horse," I said, which was not entirely a lie. "Were you?" "The horse has exceptional conformation. The horse is behind you." I was, in fact, looking directly at his forearm. This was becoming apparent to both of us. Here is what I should tell you about myself. My name is Paloma Ferretti. I am 24. I am plus size, honey blonde, and in possession of what my mother has spent 2 decades calling an inconvenient tendency toward honesty. I have blue-green eyes that apparently cannot disguise what I am thinking, a body that takes up exactly as much space as it pleases, and absolutely no talent for the particular art of feminine pretense that Italian society seems to consider a basic survival skill. I also have, it turns out, no self-preservation instinct whatsoever. "May I touch?" I asked. The stable yard went very still. Ciro did not move. His storm-gray eyes, the specific gray of winter seas off the Amalfi coast, shifted from amused to something entirely different. Something calculating, dangerous, and not at all displeased. "Do you understand what you've just asked me?" I asked whether I might touch your arm. "I wish to know if you are truly as solid as you appear, or if it is merely the shirt that suggests it." "In a stable yard, alone, with no chaperone and no witnesses. I am aware of the logistical details, Don Santangelo. Then you are also aware that in my world, a woman alone with me, in a stable yard with her hand extended, creates a rather specific set of complications. I'm sure those complications can be managed." He studied me for a long moment. I watched something move behind his composed expression, not quite a smile, but the tectonic shift preceding one, as though the mechanism existed but hadn't been activated in years and was slightly alarmed to find itself operational. "Then let's get married," he said. I blinked. "I beg your pardon. You heard me correctly. You cannot be serious. I am rarely anything else." He folded his arms, which, I should note, did not help my concentration, and regarded me with an expression that had gone from amused to deliberate. "You are unmarried." "I am unmarried." You are, I gather from the specific quality of your honesty, thoroughly unsuited to the kind of arrangement your family intends for you. I require a wife eventually, and I find I have no patience remaining for women who perform interest they do not feel." He paused. "You, Signorina Ferretti, do not appear to know how to perform. It is a considerable point in your favor." "That is not a proposal," I said. "That is an accusation dressed as one. Call it what you like. It has the advantage of being honest. You don't even know me. I know you asked to touch a stranger's arm in a stable yard, rather than curtsy politely and continue to the garden tour. I know that every woman paraded before me for the past decade has smiled and calculated and performed, and you have done none of those things." His storm-gray eyes held mine without wavering. "I find I would rather marry a woman who says exactly what she is thinking than spend 40 years guessing at a stranger's true opinion of me. That is a very poor foundation for a marriage. Give me a better one, and I'll consider it." I opened my mouth to argue and found, to my own considerable alarm, that I had no argument ready. My family had made no secret of their hopes for this season. A respectable match, ideally connected, concluded before my father's patience for Naples society expenses ran dry. I had expected to spend the coming months smiling politely at men who looked through me, or worse, at me with the specific, uncomfortable calculation of men who were trying to determine whether a plus-size woman could be made to fit their expectations if they simply applied enough social pressure. I had not expected an alternative to walk into a stable yard and offer itself so plainly, so improbably, so entirely without romance. And yet, there was something in the directness of it, in the way he looked at me as though I were a puzzle worth solving, rather than a problem to be managed, that appealed to a reckless corner of my nature I had spent 24 years carefully suppressing. "Ask me properly," I said, "and perhaps I shall answer properly." Something in his expression eased. He stepped closer, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to hold his gaze, close enough that I could feel the heat still radiating from his exertion. He held his hand open between us. "Not reaching, not claiming, offering. Signorina Paloma Ferretti," he said, low and steady. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" I looked at his open hand for a long moment. Then I placed mine inside it. "Yes," I said, "though I still intend to touch your arm eventually." That earned me the smile he had been withholding all afternoon, brief, startled, entirely unguarded, as though it had escaped him before he could decide whether to permit it. "I look forward to it, Donna Sant'Angelo." News of the engagement moved through Naples faster than either of us anticipated. My mother was delighted, already calculating the social elevation my new title would provide, and did not once ask whether I was happy. My father seemed relieved that the matter had resolved itself without the protracted negotiations he had been dreading. Neither of them questioned the speed. In our world, when a Don proposed, the only acceptable answer was the one I had already given. The wedding was 6 weeks later, a private ceremony at the Sant'Angelo Estate Chapel, beautiful and efficient, like everything Ciro touched. I stood at the altar, in a fitted gown that the tailor had designed to follow my curves rather than disguise them, because Ciro had specifically instructed her to make me feel exactly as I am, not as someone else's idea of correct. I stored that sentence in a place inside my chest, where I kept the things that mattered. The wedding night. Ciro's master suite was larger than my parents' entire apartment, all warm firelight and silk drapes, and an enormous bed that seemed designed for activities my mother had explained with such clinical horror that I had spent several years assuming romance was primarily a medical procedure. Ciro lingered at the threshold. He did not cross it uninvited. This surprised me. The most feared man in Campania had every right to enter his own bedroom. Instead, he stood in the doorway, massive shoulders filling the frame, storm-gray eyes watching me with a restraint I recognized as a gift, waiting for me to choose. I crossed the room to where he stood, tilted my head back to meet his eyes, and let the ghost of a smile touch my mouth. "May I touch?" Ciro went very still, the same stillness from the stable yard, and I watched with fascination as something dark and unguarded moved behind his composed expression. "You already know the answer to that question, Donna Sant'Angelo. I would like to hear you say it." "Yes." His voice had dropped, rough at the edges. "Always yes." I placed my palm flat against his chest, over the fine linen of his shirt. His heart was beating hard and fast beneath my hand. Proof, undeniable and thrilling, that the controlled, disciplined Don of Campania was not nearly so unaffected as he wished the world to believe. "You're nervous," I said, delighted. "I am not. You are. I can feel it. Mafia bosses," he said with the gravity of a man attempting to salvage his dignity, "do not become nervous." Then perhaps I ought to verify that a second time. I pressed closer. His breath caught. His hand rose to cradle the side of my face. The calloused, scarred hand of a man who had broken empires, now touching my cheek as though I were made of something he was terrified of damaging. He kissed me slowly, carefully, as though memorizing the shape of my mouth, and I felt every piece of armor I had ever worn, the deflecting humor, the defensive self-deprecation, the 24 years of performing smallness, dissolve into something warmer. Something that made me curl my fingers into the front of his shirt and press the full, soft weight of my body against the solid heat of him without any hesitation at all. What followed was not something I could have prepared for. It was tenderness, layered over intensity, patience shot through with hunger neither of us fully disguised. And when the candles guttered low and the fire burned to embers, I fell asleep, with my head against the broad expanse of my husband's chest, listening to a heartbeat that had, somewhere in the course of the evening, stopped pretending it belonged to an unmoved man. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us had anticipated. I discovered, to my own surprise, a genuine interest in the workings of the Sant'Angelo estate, the legitimate businesses, the restaurant investments, the careful accounting that Ciro maintained, with the discipline of a man whose father had nearly lost the empire through carelessness. I began accompanying him, not because he asked, because I was curious, and curiosity has always been my most dangerous quality. I asked questions, I read contracts, I offered opinions, and Ciro, this was the truly unprecedented part, listened. But it was the other discovery that transformed our marriage from an arrangement of convenience into something considerably more combustible. I discovered, with private and escalating delight, that I had begun to learn the specific art of dismantling Don Ciro Sant'Angelo's composure. It began innocuously enough. I adjusted his collar before a dinner, my fingers lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary against the pulse at his throat. I watched, with considerable satisfaction, as his breath caught. "You did that on purpose," he said. "Did I?" "You know precisely what you're doing, Paloma. I'm merely ensuring you're properly dressed for dinner, Don Sant'Angelo." But I had seen the flare of heat in his storm-gray eyes, and I carried the memory of it all through the meal. I trailed my fingers along his shoulder as I passed behind his chair. I accepted his hand a moment too eagerly when dismounting from the car, allowing myself to remain within the circle of his arms, a beat longer than propriety required. At a formal dinner held in our honor, our first appearance together in Naples society, Shiro held me perhaps a fraction too close as we danced, his hand firm and possessive at the small of my back. "You know exactly what you're doing right now," he murmured. I tilted my chin up, all wide-eyed innocence. "Doing what, precisely?" "Do not attempt to use my own strategy against me. I learned it from an excellent teacher." He nearly missed a step, something I noted with considerable pride, and the low sound he made, not quite a laugh, not quite a groan, told me everything I needed to know about the effect I had begun to have on the famously unshakable Don of Campania. It was an extraordinary kind of power, not the power of beauty alone, though I had begun, in the mirror of his admiration, to see my own body differently. The deeper power of being known, of understanding precisely which glance, which touch, which whispered word could unravel the careful control of a man who had spent a decade making himself untouchable. He was watching for me across crowded rooms, listening for my footsteps in the corridor, reaching for me in his sleep, with the unconscious certainty of a man who had found the only place his body wanted to be. Late one evening, weeks into our marriage, we found ourselves alone before the fire in the private sitting room adjoining our chambers. The last guests of a small dinner party had departed hours before. I had removed my shoes and let my hair down from its evening arrangement, and the sight of me like this, barefoot, unguarded, my plus-size frame curled into the armchair with the specific comfort of a woman who has stopped performing composure, seemed to strike Ciro with a tenderness that went beyond desire. "You're staring," I said, echoing his own words from the stable. "I know. Most mafia bosses would apologize for that. You're not most mafia bosses." "No." His storm-gray eyes were soft in the firelight. "I'm the one you married." He had been reading a shipping contract, the legitimate import company that formed the financial backbone of the Sant'Angelo estate. I noticed, from my armchair, that his brow furrowed at paragraph 7. "The penalty clause," I said. He looked up. "What?" "Paragraph 7. The early termination fee increases by 15% per quarter. By month 8, exiting costs more than the goods are worth. You're frowning because you've just realized someone on the other side of this negotiation is very good at math. Better than you? Nobody is better than me at math. This person, however, is a respectable second." The sound that escaped him was low, involuntary, and startled, and I realized with some delight that I had made the most feared man in Campania laugh twice in a single evening. "You wrinkle your nose," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "When you find something in the fine print, your nose wrinkles. You've done it 11 times this evening. You counted? I notice things. That is a dangerous hobby for a man in your profession. I've survived worse." The silence that followed was warm enough to heat the entire East Wing, which, I should note, I had recently suggested converting from guest quarters to an office for the legitimate restaurant operations, saving approximately €30,000 annually in rented commercial space. I mention this because even in moments of emerging romantic tension, my brain does not stop calculating. It simply calculates different things, like the precise distance between his hand on the armrest and my bare foot on the ottoman. 28 centimeters, approximately. "Stay," I said quietly. There was a long moment of charged silence, weighted with everything neither of us had yet said aloud. The growing realization that what had begun as a practical arrangement had been transforming, week by week, into something we were both terrified to name. He crossed the room and sat beside me. I lifted his hand and placed it at my waist. "Are you certain?" he murmured. "I am the one asking to be touched now," I said. I believe that settles the matter entirely. His careful control fractured. The kiss that followed carried none of the restraint of our earlier encounters. It was the accumulated weeks of glances held too long, of touches that lingered, of two people who had started as strangers and discovered, in the quiet arithmetic of ordinary days, that they had become necessary to each other. And I was falling, steadily, irreversibly, without any of the careful calculations that were supposed to govern arrangements like ours, into something I had never expected to find inside a marriage of convenience. Something I would not recognize as love until the moment I almost lost it. I found the letters by accident. Ciro had asked me to retrieve a shipping ledger from his study while he attended to a dispute at one of the warehouses. I was searching the bottom drawer when a bundle of correspondence caught my eye, tied with plain string, dated 8 months before our wedding. I opened the first one because my own name appeared on a loose note tucked among them, a list in Ciro's own hand, considerations for a potential match, family connections, political value, strategic alliance potential. My name was not on that list. The name that appeared again and again in his careful correspondence with his aunt Zia Teodora was Donna Alessia Moretti. I read further than I should have. Alessia Moretti was a widow, 30, sophisticated, connected to the powerful Sicilian operations through her late husband. Zia Teodora had championed the match with near religious fervor, and Ciro himself had written, in his own controlled hand, that Donna Moretti would be a wife of considerable strategic value, a woman who understands the demands of the position and requires no education in the responsibilities of the title. The correspondence ended abruptly, some weeks before the estate weekend where we had met. There was no explanation for why the match had never proceeded. There was only the absence of any mention of me at all, as though our entire marriage had occurred in some space separate from whatever careful calculations Ciro had been making regarding his future. I sat in his study for a very long time. I had known our marriage began as a practical arrangement. I had known it the moment he proposed in a stable yard, but I had told myself, in the weeks since, in the nights since, in the slow accumulation of whispered words and lingering touches, that whatever had begun as convenience had grown into something real. The letters suggested a different truth. They suggested that had I never wandered into that stable yard, Ciro would have married a sophisticated widow who required no instruction, no patience, no adjustment. I was the opportunity that had presented itself first. When Donna Alessia Moretti returned to Naples society, I understood immediately why her name had appeared so frequently in Ciro's correspondence. She was everything I was not: tall, slender, effortlessly elegant. She greeted me at our first meeting with a warmth so calibrated it took me several minutes to recognize the condescension folded beneath it. The new Donna Sant'Angelo. Alessia took my hand with a smile that did not reach her eyes. How fortunate you are. Ciro is not a man easily persuaded into marriage. I confess I'm curious what won him over so quickly. We found we suited, I said, with more composure than I felt. How lovely, to suit so conveniently. Her gaze traveled over my gown, my body, the whole of me, with the specific, assessing efficiency of a woman calculating exactly where to place a knife. It must be rather overwhelming, taking on such a position with so little preparation. Do let me know if I might be of assistance. I understand the demands of a great house rather intimately. The barb landed precisely where it was intended. Over the following weeks, Alessia appeared at every gathering we attended. She was never rude. She was something worse, helpful. She offered suggestions about table settings with the gentle authority of a woman who had managed a Sicilian estate for 6 years. She complimented my gown selections with a smile that somehow made the compliment sound like charitable encouragement. She asked, at a dinner, whether I found the adjustment from ordinary life to syndicate leadership terribly challenging. Not particularly, I said, though my voice sounded thin even to my own ears. How brave of you. Nobody had ever made the word brave sound so much like naive. The insecurity, once seeded, grew with alarming speed. I began noticing every mistake. The associate's wife whose name I forgot, the seating arrangement I misjudged, the Sicilian dialect phrase I mispronounced at a formal dinner, while Alessia smiled the patient smile of a woman who would never have needed to practice her pronunciation. I began comparing myself endlessly to the woman Ciro had once considered marrying, Alessia, who would never have arrived at a syndicate dinner wearing a lavender dress when protocol apparently demanded black. Alessia, who would have managed the household without a single social misstep. Alessia, who Ciro himself had judged strategically superior. I had been the reckless question. She had been the correct answer. The boldness that had defined our courtship began quietly to disappear. I stopped adjusting his collar before dinner, stopped trailing my fingers along his shoulder, stopped entering his study unannounced to curl into the chair by the window while he worked. I maintained instead a careful, correct distance, the distance of a wife who understood her place, rather than one who had mistaken convenience for genuine affection. Ciro noticed almost immediately. He noticed the absence of my fingers at his throat, the empty chair by the study window, the formality that had crept into conversations that had only weeks before been effortless and unguarded. He noticed that he missed the chaos of being provoked by his own wife, far more than he had ever expected to. It was nearly 2 weeks before he confronted me. He found me alone in the sitting room one evening, needlework abandoned in my lap, staring at nothing beyond the darkened window. "You've been avoiding me," he said, without preamble. "I've been occupied. Paloma." Something in the low weight of his voice, the specific gravity with which he said my name, broke through the composure I had been maintaining for days. Would you have married Donna Moretti if I had never come to that stable yard? Ciro went very still. Where did you hear that name? I found your letters, your considerations, family connections, strategic value, and my name was nowhere among them, because I was never part of any calculation at all. I was simply there, convenient. The first solution that presented itself to a problem you had been solving quite deliberately with someone else. Paloma, answer the question. My voice shook. I hated it. Would you have married her? He was silent for a long moment. I would likely have considered it, he said finally, and the honesty hurt exactly as much as I had feared. Alessia would have been, by every practical measure, an excellent match for a man in my position. She understands this world. She would have required no adjustment, no patience. Then I was right. You were not. His voice sharpened. He crossed the room and knelt before my chair, the most feared man in Campania, on his knees, taking my hands in both of his. Alessia Moretti would have been the correct choice for my empire, Paloma. You are the first choice I have ever made for myself. That's a pretty distinction. I'm not certain it changes anything. It changes everything. His storm-gray eyes burned into mine. The proposal in that stable yard may have begun as impulse. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But everything that came after, every week of this marriage, every moment I have spent watching for you across a crowded room, every night I have fallen asleep with you in my arms, none of that has had the slightest relation to convenience. He paused, His grip on my hands tightened. My father destroyed this empire through sentiment. He trusted the wrong people. He loved recklessly. He made decisions with his heart instead of his head, and when he died, I inherited a kingdom built on debt and betrayal. His voice was raw in a way I had never heard before. Zia Teodora watched her brother destroy everything, and she swore I would not repeat his mistakes. She taught me that a Don's marriage is an alliance, not an indulgence. That control is the only currency that matters. And Alessia was the controlled choice. Alessia was the choice that made sense on paper. She was the alliance, the strategy, the calculation. He looked at our joined hands. You were the thing I never calculated for. That doesn't sound like a compliment. It is the highest compliment I have ever paid anyone. His eyes lifted to mine. I spent 10 years rebuilding an empire by making the correct, disciplined, strategic choice in every situation I encountered. And then a woman walked into my stable yard and asked to touch my arm. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I made a choice that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that I could not bear to watch her walk away. When did that change? I whispered. He considered the question with the same careful honesty he brought to everything. When I began hoping you would walk into whatever room I occupied, he said quietly. When I learned to recognize your footsteps in the corridor before I ever saw you. When I realized that my own wife had discovered precisely how to touch me in a way that made me forget entirely what I had been about to say. His grip on my hands tightened. Alessia Moretti was never capable of any of that, Paloma. No one else has ever been. I felt the wall of insecurity I had built over the past fortnight crack open. I was afraid, I admitted. Afraid I was simply the opportunity that presented itself first, rather than a choice you would have made deliberately. You were the only choice, Ciro said, the moment you asked to touch my arm in that stable yard. Everything since has only confirmed it. He rose, drawing me up with him. I found myself smiling, despite the raw vulnerability still lingering in my chest, a smile that grew unstoppable as I watched the careful, disciplined Don of Campania look at me with an openness he had shown no one else in the whole of his guarded life. He reached for me, but did not close the final distance, waiting, as he always had, for me to choose it myself. I did not make him wait long. The letter arrived from my mother 3 weeks later. Word had reached her that the Donna Sant'Angelo had been accompanying her husband to business meetings, that I had been seen reviewing contracts, that I had, at a dinner, offered my opinion on an investment opportunity with a confidence some guests had found remarkable for a woman of her proportions. The word proportions told me everything I needed to know about the source. Donna Alessia Moretti had been feeding my mother information designed to make her worry, and my mother, who had spent my entire life trying to make me smaller and quieter and more conventional, had taken the bait. She arrived at the estate the following week, ostensibly for a family visit, clearly intent on steering me back toward a more traditional understanding of my duties. She has no business attending meetings with those men, my mother told Ciro in his study, unaware that I was standing in the corridor listening. She should be managing the household, planning dinners, producing heirs, not reading shipping contracts and offering opinions on investments. It isn't seemly, Don Sant'Angelo. It isn't what a wife of her stature should be doing. Her stature, Ciro repeated. His voice dropped to the temperature at which things stop growing. I mean her position, her experience. She's only 24. She identified a 15% penalty clause in a shipping contract that my top advisors missed entirely. Shiro's voice carried through the study door with devastating precision. She restructured the restaurant operations and saved 30,000 euros in the first quarter. She has learned the name of every associate's wife, every tenant's child, and every housekeeper's birthday. She has done this while being measured, constantly, against a woman she has never met, by people who do not understand that the most valuable thing in this empire is not its alliances, it is the woman who makes me capable of maintaining them. Silence from my mother. I will not have Paloma diminished, he said. Not by society, not by gossip, and not by her own family. She is exactly what this empire needs. Not because she fits the mold, but because she had the courage to break it. My mother departed 3 days later, considerably more subdued. But it was what happened next that truly mattered, because it was not Ciro's defense that proved transformative. It was my own. At the next syndicate gathering, 40 of the most powerful men in the region, their wives, their associates, I walked into the room in a crimson-red gown that followed every curve of my body, without apology. I did not shrink. I did not apologize for the space I occupied. I greeted the associates by name, names I had learned, businesses I understood, relationships I had mapped. I caught my mother watching from across the room, and for the first time in 24 years, what I saw in her face was not criticism, it was recognition. Her daughter, the plus-size girl she had spent 2 decades trying to make smaller, was commanding a room full of the most dangerous men in Campania, and she was doing it not despite who she was, but because of it. My mother crossed the room. She took my hands, and she said, very quietly, "You look like a queen, Paloma." It was, I realized, the first time she had looked at me and seen me clearly. 1 year later, on a warm autumn afternoon, I walked back to the stables. Ciro was there, as I had suspected, examining a new mare, coat discarded, sleeves rolled, looking exactly as he had the first afternoon we met. The golden light caught the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, and the sight of him, after a year of marriage, after arguments and reconciliations, and the slow, stubborn construction of something real from the raw materials of convenience, still struck me with the same breathless appreciation it had the very first time. He glanced up as I approached. "No," he said, before I had spoken a single word. "I haven't asked anything yet. I know that look. I have no idea what look you mean." I crossed the remaining distance and stood directly before him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his broad frame. I lifted my hand and placed it deliberately over his chest, exactly as I had that very first afternoon. "May I touch?" Ciro caught my hand in his, drawing me closer, his other arm settling around my waist with the easy, practiced familiarity of a man who had stopped pretending his body didn't belong to the woman in front of him. "You are already married to me," he pointed out. "You can hardly continue using that particular excuse. Then I shall simply have to find another one. Will you indeed? I have an entire lifetime to think of them, Don Sant'Angelo." His smile, the rare, unguarded smile I had first coaxed from him in this very spot, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The smile of a man who had spent a decade believing himself unreachable, and who had discovered that the woman brave enough to ask an improper question in a stable yard had been the only person who ever truly saw him. He kissed me there, among the horses and the golden autumn light, without hesitation, without restraint, without a single trace of the careful distance that had once defined the whole of his guarded life. And I understood, in that single, unhurried moment, that whatever had begun as an impulsive bargain between two strangers, a reckless question and a reckless answer, had become, entirely and irrevocably, a love neither of us had known to look for until curiosity had led one bold woman across a stable yard and changed the whole of both their lives. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask a question you're not supposed to ask. Not the polite question, not the safe question, not the question your mother rehearsed for you in front of a mirror. The real one, the reckless one, the one that crosses a stable yard and reaches for a stranger's arm because you need to know whether what you're feeling is real. Here's my question for you tonight. Have you ever asked a question you weren't supposed to? Have you ever walked toward something that frightened you, not because you were brave, but because your curiosity was louder than your fear? And did the answer change everything? Or are you still waiting for the courage to ask? Because the woman who asked, "May I touch?" didn't know she was asking for a marriage. She didn't know she was asking for a life. She was simply asking whether what she saw was real. It was. And the asking was what made it hers. If this story reminded you that boldness is not the absence of fear, it's the decision to reach anyway, share it with someone who needs permission to ask their own reckless question tonight. Subscribe. Ring the bell. This is Donna Paloma Santangelo. The horses are beautiful. The autumn light is golden. The collar still needs adjusting. And the answer is still, always, yes.